Hello, I'm Gunther Gouwblomme and I'm the director of the Brussels Diplomatic Academy of the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. I would like to address a short word about our academy. Brussels Diplomatic Academy holds a unique position in the international landscape of diplomatic training programs. This is due to the fact that we deal with diplomacy in its totality. So we deal with each and every subdomain of diplomacy. And we approach this in a multidisciplinary way. And on top of it, we approach this in a technical and practical way. As a result, our graduates are multi-employable. They easily find a job and they can easily switch from one subdomain to another or from diplomacy to business or the other way around. Now, our research is built around the same principle. Talking about research, this brings us to our publication, and therefore I happily and proudly present you the first edition of our BDA Currents. I wish you a pleasant and interesting reading and warmly welcome you to our academy.
Dear friends and colleagues of the BDA, finally, after months in the making, I'm pleased and proud as editor and co-author of BDA's first publication to welcome you to the launch of our first edition of the BDA Currents, where diplomacy meets business. The publication would be an annual report covering the world of diplomacy, international relations, and global business. It focuses on issues of topical interest around the centers of global power, influence, and importance, including the continents of Europe and Africa, the Middle East, China, India and Asia, Russia, and the Commonwealth of Independent States, and the transatlantic relationship between US and Europe. Issues are discussed through the multifaceted lens of diplomacy, geopolitics, global finance, corporate business accountability, and environmental sustainability. This first edition, after the COVID-19 pandemic, how does the world change? As the name suggests, examines changes in the world as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Its genesis lies in the dark period of lockdown as the pandemic deepened and the sheer scope of what we all faced started to take shape and register. As the fall ended and the long winter months of 2020 loomed, like many others, I understood that the pandemic would prove to be the turning point in so many realities, not only in the way in which we live and work, but also in the manner in which global power and relations within and between states would also shift. This understanding proved the first impulse behind the idea that an annual journal, as a contributor to wide-ranging debate and discussion on contemporary issues, was merited, and more importantly, could add value to BDA intellectual discourse as a diplomatic academy serving a wide community. And so it was BDA Currents, where diplomacy meets business, was born. As the journal's editor and one of its authors, I am proud of the finished copy. Much work has gone into it. And credit, of course, belongs to my BDA colleagues and fellow authors. They met the challenge with enthusiasm, perhaps a little bit naively as well, and committed time and scholarship in adding to the body of knowledge on a wide range of the issues which influence and shape the world in which we live. They have done so superbly, and this publication is all the more rich for it and represents our team in action. Today, Kevin, Tom, Sam, Hassan, Bashir, Guy, Sarah, Vladimir, and Mini join the conversation around this brief look at the substance of each of their chapters. And I will invite them in turn to introduce themselves and leave you, the audience, with the key takeaway from each of our chapters. Before doing so, I must thank Peter Demjank, Angora Flanders Director General, for his corporate endorsement and sponsorship of this effort. Thank you, Peter and Angora Flanders, for your generous support and confidence in who we are and our mission at the BDA. And now over to my colleagues, starting first with Kevin Verbelian. Kevin, what was the inspiration behind your chapter's contribution? Is there a key message that you wish to leave with our audience?
Yes, thank you, Len, and obviously happy to be here with you all today to present this fantastic book we've all worked on very hard. Yes, indeed, COVID is very impactful to all of us, and from the experience that I have as an expert in international trade, we've seen that also. A few things have been changing over the past years with regard to international trade policy. We have seen a rise of Chinese economic influence all over the world. At the same time, we have had quite some turbulent years under the Trump administration in the United States. And that combined with I think once in a lifetime, and let's hope that it remains in this way, of course, a once in a lifetime pandemic. It was good to also look into what the effects could be of COVID with regard to international trade. And in particular, the situation in the World Trade Organization is quite known by many in the meantime. But what we can see is that COVID-19 in a way is, as in many other places, an accelerant, a fire accelerant for issues that are happening. And also with regard to the particular situation between China, the EU, and the United States, and how this has an effect on what is happening in the World Trade Organization, given the fact that President Biden has advocated very clearly that the United States is back at the multilateral level, it was good to see what that would actually mean for the World Trade Organization, given the state in which it finds itself, as I mentioned in the situation before. So that was actually the background and the inspiration that I had to write the chapter on international trade.
Thank you so very much, Kevin. Sam, over to you. Sam Van Dam. What was your inspiration, Sam? So nice to see you again. Your inspiration behind your chapter, and what would you like to leave? What's the thought that you'd like to leave with everyone?
My inspiration for this chapter on EU dealing with COVID-19 from a perspective of public diplomacy is that there is this idea in Europe that we promote ourselves outside of Europe in this way that could be described as you too could be like us. And so the contradiction that we have now with the COVID-19 is we should ask ourselves the question, can the EU live up to its own values at home? Because if you cannot live up to your own values at home, how do you plan to promote them abroad? So I look at 6 values specific, and for these, I call them the founding values of Europe. There's consensus around that. And for each of those values, I investigate how the EU lived up to those values, considering what's been happening in the latest crisis. So I will briefly run over those 6. The first one is rule of law. So there, in this chapter, I discuss no lockdowns or late lockdowns could be seen as bad leadership, and hence, how rule of law is becoming more pressurized. Public attacks on police, legal challenges to lockdowns and curfews, and a lack of border control given the Schengen concept in Europe. So that's what I talk about on the founding value of rule of law. Number 2, I look at the value of democracy, and specifically the lack of consensus and outward contradictory information. So in this crisis in specific, there seems to be a lack of partnership between politicians on the one side, and on the other side, consensus amongst a varied group of scientists, usually national virologists with a close connection to the home office. Number three, contrasting interpretations of freedom. So limited freedom of movement is one of the things I talk about. Also conflating freedom of religion with freedom of gathering. So there have been different interpretations, say the Netherlands versus Germany, and freedom of speech. Every crisis has always been going together with an infodemic, and this is not different for COVID. Number four, human dignity. I look at individual data section blocking collective measures. There was a lot of scientific data available. However, Europe did not manage to make use of that because of more local regulations. And the right to live and die humanely in housing for the elderly, also part of the fourth value, human dignity. Number five, equality. Some seem to be more equal than others. I talk about inequality for political elites and inequality for vulnerable groups. And last but not least, I talk about respect for human rights as a luxury. And my conclusion, my key message with all this would be that before the corona crisis, there seems to be inconsistency within EU norms values that is not seen as a weakness, but as spaces for interpretation that permitted a flexible approach. However, during the crisis, EU was unavailable to offer member states a collective instrument for consistently shaping the external environment. And so after the crisis, we haven't arrived there, so this is an ongoing debate, and I invite further discussion. I would say that it's harder for the EU member states to use the EU's normative power as a collective instrument to shape its external behavior. I invite you all to read the chapter.
Thank you so much, Sam. Tom, over to you. Your own inspiration and what you'd like to leave behind today in this brief snapshot. You might need to turn on your mic, Tom, please.
Hi, Lynn. Hi, everybody. Yeah, what inspired me to write this essay is basically the signals that this planet is sending to us. Just a signal that we received over here in this region with the flooding, and the fact that nobody is taking action. Actually, as a consultant, I've been working with seaports in the range, and over 20 years ago, they developed this nice policy to change the modal shift at the benefit of this planet. And when taking the statistics, we see that after 20 years, there is 0.0% improvement or change. And that's just a fact from a scientific point of view, but I'm most used to work as a consultant in the field. And I wanted to bring together the different dynamics that I find at the business side, where companies are continuously trying to find the best production location, lowest in cost, best in quality, and also are trying now to make out business out of our sentiment for everything that is good for this planet. And on the other hand, the government that is trying to create this public value by defending our planet. And a third factor next to the businesses, the companies, and the governments is the human being and how we are involved in this system. And what I've tried to bring together in this essay is the dynamic that we have seen. First of all, the pandemic is another big signal coming from globalization. So it all comes from the same direction. And the biggest question is, are we still going for the status quo, or are we going to change? And I will bring my view on that, and I will tell at the end, and this is interesting, that if we want to change, I believe the diplomatic corps can play a very important role, making sure that the governments speak the same language as the companies and the way around. Strategy is not policy, and policy is not strategy. And I like to invite everybody to join our platform to do this, bring strategy to policy and the way around.
Thank you so very much, Tom. Very inspiring, all of my colleagues. And next, Hassan, please. I invite you to share your inspiration for your chapter, of course, and the message or messages that you want to leave today.
Okay, thank you, Lan, and hi, everybody. First of all, I would like to highlight once again that I'm very proud of being a part of this such a distinguished team and of involving in this project. And I'm the coordinator of geoanalytics at BDA, and my research focus is on rise of disruptive technologies and the influence on the geopolitics. So accordingly, my chapter is about the digitalization of the post-pandemic geopolitical landscape and its frontier role in the great power competition. So the main message is the impact of the soft power became increasingly strong in the wake of the Cold War. This effect, but shifting the focus of influence and coercion away from the hard power. This was partly due to the rise of disruptive technologies, which created a new space that offered new tools for great powers. Similar to hard power, disruptive technologies had an impact upon soft power, providing a new ground for great powers to operate upon, and also new methods and instruments for influencing soft power. And turning to post-pandemic era, the most fundamental feature of the technology and the great power relationship or marriage in the post-pandemic future would be the challenge to the preservation of the monopoly of violence by the state. Projections have been made throughout the history regarding the end of the state's monopoly on the use of force, but the current trajectory of technology changes makes such a scenario more likely and ever closer. All in all, looking to the future, the transformation of the means of production, which could cause a tremendous economic and political instability across the globe, is the most significant potential impact projected for disruptive technologies. Therefore, for high-tech and democratic economies and societies to exist, is truly crucial that a responsible global leadership prevails. This is my key message. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so very much, Hassan. And of course, in the last few weeks, last few months, we've seen so much by way of use of disruptive technologies from all corners of the world. Serious time and real important time for your own findings and your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Bashir, please. Your own very special insights, inspiration, and of course, the messages that you'd like to leave.
Thank you, Len. And equally, I've been, of course, I'm very proud to be part of this wonderful effort and to be part of this team of colleagues. I'm the head of financial diplomacy and fintech. And as such, my chapter deals with a subject that was inspired by the convergence of three elements. The first one is the increasing direct link between foreign policy decision-making, geopolitical dynamics on the one hand, and financial instruments and financial services on the other. Secondly, the rise of what we call at BDA, the geopolitics of debt, as we see around the world. And thirdly, which is the direct subject examined in this paper, is the fundamentally changing fiscal models in oil exporting countries. And these are not just the OPEC countries and the rich countries, but they include the countries of West Africa and Latin America and others. The changing, fundamentally changing shape of their fiscal models because of the convergence of COVID, but also the long-term shift in the global energy markets away from hydrocarbons, which is a structural change. The paper looks in detail at how the fiscal gap between the forecasted oil prices by these countries for their budgets relate to actual market prices, and in all cases, practically, there has been a massive deficit developing with some very direct consequences for their geopolitical environments and their foreign policy decisions, such as, for example, in the case of Nigeria and the Nigerian fiscal deficit and its impact on increased terrorist activity, among other reasons, of course, in the bordering regions in Niger, where both there are security concerns and the security concerns for Europe, but also the deployment of NATO forces in the Sahel region. And so there is a direct link between what is happening on the fiscal and financial side and geopolitics and foreign policy. The messages are two. The first one is that the typical model we've had in our diplomacy, whether it's in Europe, the US, Japan, Australia, and other parts of the world, is to either have classically trained diplomats focused on the political side doing economic work, or we have treasury officials focusing on aspects of finance. The first message is that will no longer suffice. It is extremely important to train a cadre of financial diplomats who will be able to inform the foreign policy decision-making process of these very specific dynamics that are to do with how financial services link directly to geopolitics and international relations. And the second message is regarding the oil-producing countries in particular. It is the case that practically all countries in Europe, the US, Japan, Australia, and others continue to assume that the fiscal models that have existed for 70-odd years in the oil-producing countries continue to be in place and function. That is not the case, and an immediate and urgent shift in assessing how international relations, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, will be affected by these shifts in fiscal models is indeed very important, and I think will be critical to the shape of how cooperation, international cooperation, will develop from this point onwards. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Bashir. A very, very sober assessment of the future of the world that we know and we live in. Thank you. Guy, over to you.
Hi, Lan. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, I was not listening to you.
I was just thanking you and welcoming you for your contribution on this most important topic of stakeholder capitalism and corporate social responsibility. Over to you.
Thank you, Lan. As the head of stakeholder capitalism and Latin America and the Caribbean for the BDA, my inspiration came from the fact that there is an urgent need for business to react to the demands of their relevant stakeholders on pressing environmental, social, and ethical issues in order to protect the integrity of the capitalism system. Just like the disruptive effect that the new technologies such as big data, artificial intelligence, and Internet of Things have upon companies, the relationship between companies and their stakeholders impacts their bottom line and prosperity. And companies' leaders should decide now whether to maintain the status quo that maximizes short-term profit to the detriment of reducing greenhouse emissions, pollution, uses of water, diversity, equity and inclusion, and many other aspects, or instead to implement change. There are many driving forces shaping the new business ecosystem, as well defined by the acronym ESG, environmental, social, and governance. These three letters are well known in business circles the world over as the new license to operate. The scientific evidence that the climate is dangerously changing, impacting everyone, including business, is one of the driving forces. There is also substantial data showing that inequality is rapidly growing due to numerous factors, including the vast and sophisticated technological advances in the production, operations, and distribution of goods and services, reducing the need for large payrolls. So only a few companies could leverage this technological revolution, those whose market values are in the hundreds of billions and, in a handful of cases, trillions of US dollars. Another fact that confirms the new license to operate for businesses is the recent disclosures of how companies indirectly support structured racism and discrimination on the basis of gender, LGBTQ+ status, immigration status, and age by failing to evolve and update their recruitment, training, and promotion process. So my chapter is a modest contribution to the discussion and on how companies could engage with their stakeholders. And a very important point here is, today, a stakeholder is anyone. A stakeholder could be an individual with a cause that goes to social media and mobilize other stakeholders. And stakeholders could be consumers, investors, employees, business partners, regulators, constituents. So we're talking about people, and people are demanding changes from governments and from companies. In this chapter, I also bring some elements from the EU Green Deal, especially the ones concerning new governance from the companies based here in Europe or doing business here in Europe. So the message is simple. We have to change and have to change now. Thank you, Lan.
Thank you, Guy. Especially after the events of the last week across this part of Europe, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, your contribution couldn't be more timely. Thank you.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, my friend. Vladimir, please, over to you and your contribution.
Thank you for the floor. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. And I feel it's a tremendous honor to actually contribute to this bundle of tremendous expertise. Now, as a head of expertise pillar that deals with Commonwealth of Independent States, obviously I wrote about my region. But there were some things that sort of changed my perspective on what I'm writing about and how exactly I'm writing. The thing is, when I was working on gathering the materials to make the article or the chapter a little bit more coherent, I found out that a lot of academic research papers somewhat shooting in the future. Let me explain. When we're working on making a book or a bundle or an academic article on such urgent thing as pandemic that has very, very, very strong dynamics, and we're talking about also a region that has its internal dynamics, we very often somewhat late with our conclusions. Now, that was a dangerous trap to fall into, which is why when I was thinking on the approach on how to write, I thought that the more important thing to do would be not talk about solely numbers or economical impact, but more about trying to highlight how the region really copes, how it operates, and pandemic, as any critical situation, actually exposed a lot of critical points in the region I was writing about. So my chapter is called Understanding CIS Through the Prism of COVID-19 Pandemic, and it's exactly it. What I was trying to do there is to show the most problematic aspects that prevail, the social lives, the political lives, the economical situation in those countries, and how pandemic actually showed us what are the most critical, what are the most painful points are. I was not talking only about the numbers, which were quite dreadful and still are, even despite that the vaccines are deployed currently, even despite that most of the world seems to start crawling out of these years of nightmare. What I was mostly focused on is on the problems that have been always affecting the CIS region, and that pandemic made it somewhat more visible. For instance, the issues of religion, how the religion affected the multiple, multinational, multicultural societies, how the political crises that were cooking there underneath for years are now coming to the surface. If you look at the international relationship between the different CIS countries, and if you look at them internally, if you look at Kazakhstan, Belarus, Russia, we all more or less know what's going on, but none of us really trying to get into the bottom of it. And the bottom of it is a social and cultural background. Because of how the region has been constructed and how it is very, very, very rich in terms of different cultures, in terms of different religions, and in terms of how we perceive a very important geopolitically region as something that is very not quite exactly like that. For instance, Russia is not, we always think of it as a big influential country, but its medical system is not quite as rich and not quite as powerful as we might think of a country of that importance or of that size, or of the interaction between the different states, because we often perceive CIS as one sort of post-Soviet bloc, but it doesn't operate this way anymore, and long not. And the COVID-19 pandemic exposed all those problems. And why I think this chapter and the chapter of the others is relevant, because we all talk about the world, the post-pandemic, but we also talk about our expertise in terms of how the pandemic actually showed us what needs to be changed and showed us what has to be addressed and in which way. Now, as somebody who is not specialized in economy or in politics, I always tend to approach things from more humanist perspective, from more human perspective. And I think the message that I was trying to convey through my chapter was that if we are to deal with different regions that we're not used to culturally, and that is different from our system culturally, politically, socially, economically, we have two options. We have to accept it and try to deal with it somehow, or we just don't. And I think in the world that is increasingly globalized and that is increasingly getting together and that is increasingly dependent on each other in terms of effort, we really need to learn to work together. So this is what I was trying to show through the prism of the extremely tragic human catastrophe, which is the pandemic. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. I mean, I remember just reading your early drafts and learning so much about this fascinating historical part of this world. And thank you so much for this amazing contribution to our collective effort. And now over to Africa with Sarah, please. Tell us about your inspiration, your chapter.
Thank you, Len. Colleagues and friends of the BDA.
I am really delighted, and I believe it's just about time for this launch. But it's been my privilege and honor to belong to this group. And as the head of the African pillar, I feel it is really important defining the meaning of diplomacy, getting to know that we cannot conduct business without negotiation between nations. And I feel that COVID-19 just brought out that moment. My message actually is about solidarity. In the wake of the pandemic, we saw Africa rise up. There was so much skepticism, and I do recall that international discussions were all filled with this narrative of an Africa in crisis, a continent that would be decimated. Well, thank God that didn't happen, but we did see a trend where political inputs didn't actually help very much when it came to curbing the spread of the virus in the later months. But initially, we saw a lot of effort, especially under the auspices of the Africa Union. We saw the Africa CDC coming up and really coordinating a lot of activities. We saw the World Bank team up with people, something that was realized in March this year, with African counterparts. And all that is very commendable. And without the COVID-19 diplomacy, without the vaccine diplomacy, I don't think the very small percentage of 2% out of 1.3 billion African people could even have been realized. Now we have about 3% that's been vaccinated, which is good news. And we are moving on. I think we see a trend where, although the variants are kind of mutating and creating new problems, especially in the southern part of the region, I believe we are headed towards the right direction. And I think with all the development partners from across the globe, we stand a chance of beating this virus. I think we'll overcome the challenge. So the other thing I like to say is that without diplomacy, we cannot actually address those areas that we so much need to address, areas of peace and restorative justice. However, at this point in time, Africa is well endowed with resources and a very youthful population. But that population must be supported, must be protected, because health is the basis of our protection. I would have a lot to add, but because our chapter was written at a time when the virus had not spread the way it spread now, and some countries are actually going through the fourth tier, I feel that it is probably not the right time to talk about the achievements, but maybe towards the end of the year, we should be able to look at what our development partners have done. Thank you, Lynn. Do you have any specific question?
No, Sarah, you've taken care of them for the moment, but thank you so very, very much for your important contribution to this collective effort of ours. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Minnie, over to you.
Thank you, Lan. First, I would like to say I'm really proud to be part of this wonderful BDA team. I'm from Turkey, and the Middle East is very close to my country of origin. Therefore, I'm really grateful being Middle East coordinator at the Brussels Diplomatic Academy. This pandemic has become a turning point in modern economic, social, and cultural history. This very first global common experience has challenged our human-centric way of thinking and acting. The question is therefore for us now, who is the real master This is one of my inspiration. The answer will certainly be, it's not exclusively us, Homo sapiens sapiens. And it will oblige all international structures to prove that are able to serve their member effectively, to be or not to be. And of course, in the Middle East region. And are they able to their expertise, finances, and practical help? And this pandemic, COVID-19, is the very first globally lived common experience for humanity, for us. Yes, of course, globalization had brought us closer together, but we lived on a fragmented globe still, and no event in history had yet been felt by all as something touching us directly, not even Second World War or HIV. So for the first time, the COVID-19 created something with direct and indirect consequences for every society and all of us and citizens of our globe. And if a competition for a year of the Black Swan describes a rare event that is hard to predict, and I think the year, 2020, will be a prime candidate, year of the Black Swan. This metaphor describes a rare event that is hard to predict and beyond normal expectations, a metaphor which comes as a surprise and might even broaden our perception of the reality. And in the Middle East is a region with a variety of confrontation, as you know well, civil society, civil war, climate, corruption, demography, foreign intervention, gender inequality, human rights, migration, petrol, religion, rule of law, etc. And now with COVID-19 as a new challenge for the region. This pandemic highlights the need for effective and accessible healthcare structural problems, especially transparency, anti-corruption, and a stronger role for civil society now. As well, the need for decentralization, social protection, and for economic diversification away from a single sector, whether hydrocarbons or tourism. And this is my last sentences. Lastly, I would like to announce, or I would like to share with you, happy to share with you, my policy recommendation. In the region, none of the countries looked for exchange or cooperation with others in the region. Therefore, in my opinion, there is need for a Middle East regional pandemic agency to learn from this pandemic and to prepare for future ones. And the EU, I mean Brussels, has the experience setting up such multilateral agencies. Brussels will be therefore a natural partner in identifying structure and functioning, and even assisting financially, maybe, in implementation. Thank you so much, Lan.
Thank you so very much, Minnie, sharing a light on an issue which, before I started reading with you your early drafts, had not realized that that level of cooperation so badly needed in times of crisis was actually not taking place. So this was a superb policy recommendation as your very big conclusion.
Yeah, why not? It's possible. Yeah, thank you so much, Lan.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, well, thank you so very much, all of you. And now just a couple of words on my own chapter. It discusses the transatlantic relationship, the grand alliance which oversaw conditions for peace, security, stability, and prosperity over large tracts of the world for the last 70 plus years, certainly since World War II. The last 4 years under the previous US administration were, of course, very difficult for the transatlantic relationship, as well as many other allies. But the world did move on, alliances became much more transactional. Containment of China's rise proved not to be an effective strategy for the Western world. Even more important is the fact that democracy and its many principles have come under attack, not only from external actors, but more troubling from those at home. And while the new administration in Washington brings hope for recommitment to the transatlantic relationship, the world has changed. The perception of citizens in Europe with respect to the role of the United States in the world has also changed. Americans, too, today need and want their government to pay particular attention to issues on the domestic front that require fixing at home. Global power, too, has shifted and is becoming much more diffuse. And in this dynamic and changing landscape, in my chapter, I argue that while the transatlantic relationship remains so very important, it will no longer be enough to shape the world as it did over the last many decades. And so there you have it, friends and colleagues of the BDA. On behalf of my colleagues, we thank you for joining our launch today. We thank as well the effort of our publisher, ASB Editions, especially Ruth, Marie, and Nike, for their support in bringing the seed of this idea to reality. We hope that all of you will consider our annual journal, this one, as part of your own personal libraries and part of your journey as you continue through this life. Thank you so very much to all of you for joining us. Thank you and goodbye.